Welcome back to all of you. I had the chance to go through both breakout session and enjoy very rich discussion. So I will now give the floor to our partners who organized the session, who can give us a taste of what was discussed in the respective breakout rooms. So I will leave now the floor to Johan Vine from the UN, who will tell us about the discussion on sustainable housing and urban planning in breakout group 1. Johan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, colleagues. Yeah, we had a really rich discussion. So basically, we heard, first of all, a bit of an introduction, and then we heard 3 really key examples of the challenges and opportunities around housing and urban planning in Uganda, the US, and Lebanon. Lots of sort of really key things came out, which were very sort of cross-cutting across, like through all 3, and also in the conversations that came after. While there are very different contexts in these 3 countries and in the 3 cities mentioned, things like the data challenges as well, and the compatibility of data, and at the level at which we have data is always has been brought up, and I think we can all agree on that. I think that maybe just to point out one key thing, especially when it does in relation to data, because it was really interesting and it was a very different and fresh perspective, was when we talk about data itself, and for unaccompanied migrant children, for example, or migrant children in general, because it's true that we tend to do data and from the perspective of adults and their families, and we don't really have targeted data for children necessarily, and so not fully understanding the needs of children, especially if they're unaccompanied, doesn't allow us to really actually protect them. And that led to an example in the US related to making sure, for example, that there is housing in the city centre or in cities or in areas where children can be protected, can live, and can also have access to close by education and services to protect them in their migratory journey or where they end up. And I think this is really a different way of looking at it, and it does bring to the sort of aspect of data more broadly, in the sense that there is the data on migration itself, but there is also the fact that we collect a lot of data, but we don't actually disaggregate it by migratory status either, which is another way to go around it. And there is actually a guide that just came out on that by IOM, in terms of like another way to sort of make sure that we are bringing in the data on migration into data that we already collect, as well as the targeted data that we do need, for example, for migrant children. So that was like a really key point. And then we talked then about the different sort of, all along the guiding questions, in terms of what are, and I will phrase this in the sense of like, what are the sort of key success factors or key considerations when it comes to housing and urban planning for migrants and refugees, and based on the experiences shared. One was also, of course, not only do we, in terms of like empowering the local authorities or the cities themselves, but actually about the information being available to migrants themselves to ensure that they also have agency, and it has to be from sources that they trust, so that they can really make more informed decisions about where to live and what services they can access, which also helps ensure their protection and protects from exploitation and things like that. But of course, there is the challenge of how we then reach everyone. So again, it came up a few different times, the fact that this need for multi-stakeholder partnerships, with the city sort of being the sort of pivotal actor that can bring together, civil society, migrant associations, etc., who are much better connected to the territory and better connected to more vulnerable migrants. And so, and can also actually make sure that this sharing of information and access to people can actually enhance also the referral mechanisms to different services as well. So this is absolutely key. And then there is, of course, the whole idea of the fact that we should be promoting, to the extent possible, the inclusion of migrants and refugees and migrant associations, ethnic associations in urban planning itself. I think you know, this was something that came up. This has come up in on these occasions and these types of discussions, but broadly across the board. And I just wanted to also mention that this is something that's been so recognised, and there's lots of key examples out there of how that's been done. But there is actually also Habitat and IOM together have created a guidance on how to do that, on how to integrate migrants into and refugees into urban planning itself, and with key indicators and guidance on that for urban planners, like for the sector of urban planning. So there is a lot of experience out there on that, and there is a tool coming out shortly as well. But it is definitely something that there was a lot of agreement on in this and many other conversations we've had over the years. And then yeah, I was just making sure that I was catching my notes. I think one key point as well is the need for local and central governments to design sustainable livelihood strategies for host and for the host community and for refugees, rather than sort of depend on the aid from central government or, for example, UNHCR, which is not sort of in the long term sustainable. And this leads us to another really excellent point. When we then asked the donor, we were pleased to have the presence of the EU there, from INTPA, and looking at this idea where we were thinking, well, what can donors do better to support this process? And one suggestion is having a more long-term kind of like application, like a longer-term planning to allow for this, because when we build multi-stakeholder partnerships, when we start to try to integrate migration into urban planning, etc., this isn't something you can just do in a few weeks or in a few months. But unfortunately, and as it was well pointed out by USLG, the discourse, the political discourse, and the way that we react to migration is often seen from an emergency context, rather than a sort of long-term planning spend.
We need to leave some time also for wrap up from the other session. Sorry.
No problem. This is my last 2 points. And so, yeah, in terms of, we had quite a lot of good discussion on the donor aspect in terms of how things could be done better in relationship. But it's true that as a big donor, how do we then work at the local level? How do we work with large grants versus small grants? And again, this comes back to multi-stakeholder partnerships and partnering up, whether it is dealing with large or small grants. And so this multi-stakeholder partnership aspect was really clear. And then just finally, very quickly, one of the other things that I think we could talk about in terms of like what donors can do and what we can think of as international community is obviously making sure that we are supporting vertical coordination between local and national government, and the national government understanding the key role of the local authorities and cities to actually act as migration governance actors, because often they go without resources, without competencies, etc. And this lack of competency and capacity and understanding and data is what are the main challenges to actually allowing a city to act in most cases, unless the city has resources and is already on its path to doing that. And then obviously supporting decentralized cooperation within development aid around cities which have migratory channels or have similar migration issues. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for this great wrap up. I'll leave the floor to Laura Linda Halley from UNICEF to tell us about session 2. Thank you, Linda.
Thanks so much, Anna. It's my pleasure to report back, and I'll be as brief as I can because it was a very rich discussion, but I know we're running short on time. So there's 3 kind of key areas that I feel came up during the discussion that a lot of the interventions aligned with. So firstly, local governments have a really critical role to play and can be accelerators in terms of facilitating integration, supporting inclusion, and developing a more positive narrative around migration. And we heard that while there are many challenges in changing the narrative, local governments and their partners are really uniquely placed to change hearts and minds, to influence public perceptions about migrant and displaced populations, and to really shine a light on their positive contributions to the community and to local economies. So to really balance out the narrative based on evidence. We heard that who is speaking is really important and that the mayor can play a really critical role. And in addition to this, it's really important to ensure a range of different voices are contributing from different partners, private sector, communities, to contribute towards changing the narrative. The second point is that we heard solutions exist. we heard that local governments are already playing a critical role in shaping a more positive narrative. So through incubating solutions and generating evidence on what works. For example, we heard from the city of Lausanne, which has worked to develop an evidence-based diversity guide showing how migrants really enrich the city and highlighting policies that support integration and prevent racial discrimination. And we also heard about how they've encouraged engagement of migrants and also youth in political processes to improve democracy in the city. We heard how cities are ensuring access, inclusive access to local services, regardless of status, and working to overcome language barriers. And how we can do this by ensuring firewalls are in place between immigration authorities and undocumented populations. We also heard about how cities are promoting measures to combat xenophobia and discrimination and supporting social inclusion by creating connections and real opportunities for migrants and host communities to interact. Also partnering with communities.
I'm really sorry to interrupt you because we need to leave the floor to the last speaker.
Sure. I guess
I'm
my
sorry.
final point that came through really strongly was the importance of empowerment and participation and really co-creating solutions and co-creating a narrative. And so I think, you know, in closing, I would say that migrants and displaced populations really are partners. And with the right support, including access to services and opportunities and support that's needed, they really have potential to be great innovators, job creators, pillars of families and communities. So as we move forward from this discussion, let's make sure we really listen to migrant and displaced people carefully and do nothing about them without them, because we really can and must co-create solutions. I'll finish there. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was really insightful. And I'll leave now the floor to Mr. Erwa Martin. It's the head of migration and displacement team in INPA within the EU Commission. Thank you so much, Mr. Martin, for joining the conversation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think clearly concluding on such an important topic, on broad topic, is impossible in principle, and even less so in 2 minutes. So I will just be very quick on two or three things. One, I really would like to confirm that in my experience as commission official on diplomat, I have seen really the urban topic, the urban agenda coming much more strongly. I negotiated the New York Declaration in 2016 on the Compact on Refugees in 2018, and there it's very clear about the importance of this. And one of the distinctive features of the Global Compact on Refugees is really the fact to address simultaneously the refugees and their host communities. That's really extremely important, taken very seriously by our colleagues of UNHCR and also by us in the way we are working on burden sharing. Now, about the EU, it has already been referred to the urban agenda of the EU, which is more about inside the EU. Of course, it's part of the regional and urban development policy. And indeed, integration of migrants and refugees is one of the 13 priorities. On the other hand, on migration, there is the EU Action Plan on Integration and Inclusion that underlines the role of the cities as critical stakeholders and critical partners. That's evident. Now, externally, in our external action, we recognize, of course, migration as an integral part of development policy, and also the urban theme, the urban agenda. The importance of cities is there for us as well. And of course, very important now that we are entering in the next phase of programming of our external assistance with the NDICI Global Europe Instrument for the next 7 years, with an additional challenge, which is COVID, as we all know. So I will not repeat what has been said eloquently, but I would like to mention 2 or 3 points that I find particularly interesting in the discussion and also in the guidance. One, take into account the context specificity on the local situation. Be serious about that. That's very important as an instrument as such of inclusion. The absolute need to work with local authorities, being realistic about the fact that when you have democratic local leadership, they have needs, they have an agenda, they have a timeline. And most of the time, migrants are not electors. So how do we engage them? How do we make it positive to support the narrative. That's important. Important to collaborate with the bureaucrats at local level as well and work on the coordination between the various levels. Thank you very much. Message well heard. The cooperation with the private sector, no doubt, and also with social actors and all the civil society. And we know that in many cases it's through very simple activities, sports club, parishes, other community organizations that in fact you have an integration actually of the people. A very quick remark just about a very recent interesting paper of the European Policy Center on city diplomacy, city twinning as signals of autonomous decision making. So just a reference, have a look, that's very interesting. Finally, in terms of what the guidance that has been produced offers, very good, thank you. It's very interesting in terms of sustainable urban development and inclusion. We will use that as a reference, and we are happy to continue partnering with all the partners that have worked on this and use that also as a useful element of guidance. I stop there because in the interest of the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Ms. Martin, and thank you for pointing to critical aspect and in particular to the need to keep in mind that yes, we are addressing local authorities. They represent a local constituency of which migrants formally are not part as electors. So what are the other ways to give voice to this minority and to make sure that acting on the interests of migrants come across as acting in their interest, on the interests of everyone. I thank you all, and in particular, all the organization who worked to create the guidance. It was a 2-year tireless effort. We really push through different obstacles to try to frame that guidance in a way that was most useful for cities and that can really enhance what we have learned from contexts that are very different. We hope it can be picked up by cities, by practitioners, by donors, and we hope to continue learning through the new tools that I think this was also an opportunity to learn, to catch up on what other knowledge has been producing, data has been produced since then. Thank you to all of you, and we look forward seeing you in the next event and continue collaborating with you.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone.